And this talk was somewhat inspired by a recent conference that I attended, which was the Wildlife Society conference in Winnipeg, Manitoba, a couple weeks ago. And before I get too involved, I want to thank the Wildlife Society and Jennifer Forby, who I stole some of these ideas from. These are not online ideas. We're kind of merging several of the inspirations that I got from the conference into this talk. Our plenary speakers and also my boss in the lab for sending me to Winnipeg. And if you don't know me, I'm a wildlife biologist, wildlife ecologist. And the topic of this year's plenary at the Wildlife Society conference was, why do wildlife matter? And this was actually a difficult question for 2,000 wildlife biologists to answer. But the thought was that if we can answer it as a profession, maybe we can tell or let the public in on like some kind of secret and have them care as much about wildlife as we do. But for most of us, answering the question was pretty difficult, and for a lot of us, it somewhat evoked an image, and this image could have been a place, and a place that kind of connected us to nature when we were younger, which is probably why we became wildlife biologists. And this is one of my places. This is Panther Creek in Northeast Georgia, where I grew up in Georgia, where I used to go hiking and camping pretty frequently. But other ideas that came up about why wildlife mattered to wildlife biologists were ideas like ecosystem services, hunting and fishing, and also some kind of intrinsic or spiritual value that we couldn't really put into words very easily. However, that's when talking to a group of wildlife biologists. And I'm not sure that our values and attitudes towards wildlife are going to be represented by the public or society as a whole. So I think instead of asking a bunch of wildlife biologists, why do wildlife matter, we need to back up and ask society, do wildlife matter? So a few things that we know about wildlife is that 10,000 years ago, they comprise about 96-97% of all of the vertebrate, land and air vertebrate biomass, whereas today, humans and their domesticated animals comprise about 96-97%. And it's the same if we look at global terrestrial mammals. Humans comprise about 32%, domestic animals about 65%, leaving only 3% for wild terrestrial mammals. It's also been theorized that we're in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. Some scientists have said that within 500 years, about 3/4 of the species that inhabit the Earth right now will be extinct. And we also know that climate change is exacerbating that extinction. Different species respond to climate change in a variety of different ways. A number of ways that probably equals the number of species or populations there are. We can generalize those and talk about direct influence of increased temperature or alterations in precipitation fluctuations, saltwater intrusion, rain shifts, also the spread of invasive species or pathogens. One thing that really interests me, though, is phenological shifts, which causes seasonal mismatches. It might not be quite as obvious. And I think that's very exemplified here by the snowshoe hare. So hares change their pelage color based on photo period, or the number of daylight hours or light hours in a day. So obviously, as it's getting warmer, snow melt is happening earlier, and these guys are kind of left with a high predation risk because they stick out like a sore thumb. And these things are starting to make the headlines, and hopefully society is seeing these headlines. This is one headline that I found: climate change will reduce biodiversity because global warming is happening too fast for animals. And even a lot of our charismatic megafauna are being pushed to extinction by climate change. But what I worry about is that no one cares. Does society actually think that wildlife matters? And we can use a study that was done in 2013 by the Pew Research Institute. So this showed that American society ranked protecting the environment somewhere in the middle of the public's priorities. And in fact, just over half of Americans thought that the President and Congress should have a top priority of preserving or protecting the environment. What we do know is that the public cares about money, they care about war and terrorism, and they care about their health. And I think that this divide between nature and people is actually getting worse, or it's getting larger. I shouldn't say worse, it's getting larger. And some evidence is that, this was a poll done that shows that the majority of millennials would actually be very uncomfortable being on a week-long vacation unplugged for a week. So without their phones, without their internet, for just 1 week, they would be very uncomfortable. 71% of millennials said that. Somewhat similarly, about 56% of millennials say that they would prefer using their vacation time to visit large cities instead of state and national parks or smaller towns or even beach resorts. So my fear with that is the sense of place that a lot of us got, maybe some of you in this room, when you were a child that connected you to nature might be turning from something like this into something very much more urban. But I think we can change that maybe. And this might kind of bother some wildlife biologists. It kind of bothers me at first. But what if we exploit what we know the public cares about and somehow put wildlife in the middle of that? So for example, when I talk about sharks, what have we all heard about sharks this year? There was a lot more shark attacks this year than a few other years. I think climate change is moving the sharks around. But overall, the society does not care about sharks. They could probably care less if they live or die. But what if society knew that sharks can save them hundreds of millions of dollars, increase their health, and also increase defense? And what if it were true? And it is. The Navy is actually using artificial shark skin to develop their ships now, because shark skin is made of they have these nano ridges that doesn't allow things to attach to it. So the Navy is using this to design their ships so that mussels and barnacles don't attach to the ship. And this has saved the public about $250 million. It's also increased or decreased the drag on ships and increased their fuel efficiency. And what's cool is another researcher somewhat piggybacked off that and said, well, if the Navy's using this for ships and things can't attach to the ships, what if we use the same technology as surfaces in hospitals so that bacteria cannot attach to the surfaces, thereby reducing the possibility of contacting some kind of superbug like MRSA? So another example is sagebrush. This is some sagebrush in Idaho. So sagebrush, a lot of different species in the genus have chemicals that have anti-cancer properties, antifungal properties, and antibiotic properties. And now researchers are actually watching the foraging behavior of animals such as sage-grouse and rabbits to determine the chemical composition of these chemicals in the sagebrush plants, and then testing the plants for these medicinal properties. I'll give you one more example. MIT and the Army are developing body armor using spider silk, and the spider silk's like 20 times lighter than Kevlar, but it's also much stronger. And this is still a ways off, but in the future we think that this can help our defense and also our police forces. So what if we change the titles from how we're losing biodiversity and this charismatic megafauna is going extinct to how wildlife can benefit you as the public? And so it might look something like this. Saving species saves you money, helps fight war and terrorism, and cures diseases. And I would love your thoughts on this. And that's all I have today. Yes?
Isn't that the concept of ecosystem services, though? Is what the ecosystem can do, provide as a service?
Of course.
Intrinsic value?
100%. Well, kind of depends. For me, ecosystem services, I mean, you can argue should humans be involved in that ecosystem service or not. But if you have a headline that says, hey, saving the lesser prairie chicken actually helps save the ecosystem, no one cares about that. So then we still have to kind of flip it and exploit their feelings and attitudes about wildlife to say, this is how it actually helps you. Ecosystem services will help you because here is the drug that we have found, or here is the money that is saving you. So just going a little bit further into that.
Well, that would also have some of the criticism of pushing back against fossil fuel, moving away from fossil fuels, is that we need fossil fuels to help poor and the developing nations, and that if you're not human-centric, then you look to something else.
Right.
But so the idea is that all of us elitists, the intellectual elite, are not human-centric, we're somehow species biocentric, and that's a different ethical value system.
Right, and one way, I had a slide, I skipped it for time reasons, but I think that climate change is already doing this. Of course, here's a bunch of headlines from climate change recently. Now, we're not saying climate change necessarily, we're not quite at that point. Climate change is costing you money, but these are the headlines that you see. droughts costing billions of dollars and wildfires and storms, whereas we haven't really been putting that monetary value or that medicinal value on wildlife in the terms that people I think can wrap their head around. And yeah, it's a little bit different. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think part of it is not just people not attaching to the issue, but it's what to do about it. So, for instance, some of the other ones you brought up with like terrorism or health or corruption, they know the steps to curb those things from happening. But when you talk about wildlife and extinction, they say they care about it, but they're like, okay, but then what? So what are your thoughts on that?
Vote and contact your representatives. I mean, we have such a low turnout in voting right now, and we have, you can also, of course, research it more and get involved, but I mean, I think voting is where a lot of it has to start. It has to start somewhere locally and get involved that way.
If we can't take care of it with more guns, it's not a problem.
Yes, sir.
I think one of the issues that has to be addressed is to get the economists to start including the cost of the destruction of nature as part of the economic cost of whatever you're doing.
Right.
Because that's generally they ignore those costs.
Right. And that's very difficult to do. I mean, as a wildlife biologist and a conservationist, I don't really like to put a value on wildlife or clean air or clean water, but maybe we have to go in that direction and have some kind of somehow try to put a monetary value on these resources.
Well, it's a real cost.
Right.
And when that's ignored, then we're not looking at the whole economic picture.
Exactly. Yes, sir.
Could you put the slide back up of the relative biomass? I mean, I found that stunning. I had no idea that wildlife had dwindled. These are Greenpeace. Okay, you've got them cited as your
Right.
peak oil.
Barrel.com.
Anyways, you consider these reliable statistics?
Yes, actually, I have heard the same statistics from a lot of scientists, but they have not published that, so I had to come back to Greenpeace in this place to actually find the graphs that I wanted to show.
So by domestic animals, you mean all the cattle, all the just meat industry.
Right, and I have a note
animals.
here. So this was on average, with the mammals, 6.9 billion people averaging about 50 kilograms each. So that's 350 million tons. Cow biomass exceeds 650 million tons. That's estimating 1.3 billion cows conservatively weighing 500 kilograms each. So it says the only other wild species in the running is Antarctic krill. But of course, that's not a terrestrial mammal. So krill actually.
Okay, so this is terrestrial, not
This is
planetary.
Right, terrestrial mammals.
Okay, so
only.
the fish would make a difference.
Right.
But what about birds? Are they? We don't have. I mean, they just don't stack up in the.
Yeah, they don't weigh anything. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. Yeah.
Because they seem to thrive just fine, fitting themselves into our human-built landscapes, as opposed to other, like leopards and stuff.
It depends on the species. Now, there are common species that you see often, your grackles and cardinals and mockingbirds, of course, but there's a lot of species of birds. In fact, the Audubon Society just recently put out a report in 2015 that over half of our birds in the United States are in peril from climate change, which is a lot of different species. So some of these common ones that we do see often, it's kind of like the raccoons or the squirrels. We're losing a lot of other birds, though, for sure. But in biomass terms, maybe so, but we're still losing that biodiversity, obviously.
What is the magnitude of the current biomass compared to what it was 10,000 years ago? Because
in vertebrate biomass, that's something I looked for and I could not find. How much weight is in.
Right, because this can be a little bit misleading. If the total biomass has increased dramatically, then the total wild bit may not have decreased as much as this implies.
And I thought about that as well. I could not find that. However, when you're thinking about the resources that are needed to keep this biomass at this level and the food and habitat resources, then I think it still could be somewhat compared. I mean, we could still compare the two because
Okay, so this is mammals. So birds,
This is mammals.
birds are not in this chart anyway.
Right,
Sorry.
this is mammals, but
Okay.
that's land and air vertebrates. And they're all, they're
okay.
very similar, which I thought was interesting. But I think that's just showing that there's just not a lot of birds, not a lot of other vertebrates. You can tell because they're so similar. There's only a couple more percentage points in the bar graph. So
I mean, my point is that we're showing percentages over here, but it's the question is, has the total wildlife biomass decreased, or is it simply that the humans and their domestic have increased so much?
well, I think it's both.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely both. But just saying though, like, but when you think about even if we've increased a lot, you think of a long time ago, the habitat needed to sustain that amount versus what we need now, even with the increase or with the change.
Yeah.
It's just so drastic that. But I did look at that and I could not find a good source for that. Yeah.
Is it possible that you could add another factor? A lot of discontented millennials think about wellness or being. So that's a little bit separate than just health. We're talking about mental health. So is there a possible way to include that as a cost benefit for flipping the script?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of studies that have been done recently on how, and there's actually a whole field of this study, right? Particularly with one of our plenary speakers was Richard Liu, who wrote Last Child in the Woods, or the nature deficit disorder thing. So there's like this whole field of study now that shows that our mental health can be and often is tied to the natural world. So that's definitely something that could be exploited, I guess, a little better. Thank you.